Good evening and welcome to the 2022 Blueprint for Free Speech Whistleblowing Prizes. Now, scratch the surface and behind many of the biggest stories of the year, and 2022 has been a year of really significant developments, and you will find a whistleblower, without whom critical information would not have reached the public domain. Many put themselves at significant risk to do this invaluable service. Their professional and personal lives may suffer as a result of doing the right thing. That is why Blueprint for Free Speech started giving these awards back in 2016. These prizes both recognise the importance of individual whistleblowers and provide practical support. The winners you will hear from this evening, who have made vital contributions to the public record, will share prize money of £20,000 sterling. Do join us as we celebrate the bravery, integrity and commitment to the public interest of our 2022 award winners for the first time on Byline TV. Whistleblowers are often the frontline shock troops in the fight against corruption. They have the greatest positive impact and bear the heaviest cost. Nowhere is this more apparent than in South Africa, where a whole array of state institutions were infiltrated and repurposed by politicians and their criminal networks for personal financial gain. This year, 4 whistleblowers from South Africa are receiving special recognition awards for their role in exposing state capture and drawing attention to wrongdoing in the police service. For the past 4 years, South Africans have been glued to their television sets, watching one witness after another appear before a commission of inquiry into state capture chaired by Judge Raymond Zondo. The witnesses presented excruciatingly detailed evidence of massive-scale state corruption. The Zondo Commission, as it came to be known, must be regarded as the mother of all corruption inquiries. It would be hard to find comparable examples anywhere in the world of any other country subjecting itself to such an intense degree of self-criticism, deep soul-searching and scrutiny. As a result, South Africans have become very vocal in denouncing any whiff of state corruption and in demanding accountability. The words state capture and captured have entered the common lexicon and become household phrases. The Commission initially focused on former President Jacob Zuma and his network of cronies. But no one in government has escaped censure, including the current President, Cyril Ramaphosa, and his family. In particular, South Africa's ruling party, the African National Congress, and its office bearers were revealed to be thoroughly corrupt, willing to take bribes to swing massive state contracts to unscrupulous multinational companies. The Zondo Commission, which released its final report this year, marked a turning point in South Africa's fight against state corruption and became a shining example to the world of how ordinary citizens can demand accountability from their political leaders. Judge Zondo specifically singled out the contribution made by brave whistleblowers whose testimony and evidence exposed the depth of the rot. So, let's meet some of those brave whistleblowers, starting with Cynthia Stimpel, who ran the Treasury Department of South Africa's national carrier, South African Airways. The airline's board, which at the time was chaired by a close associate of President Zuma's, tried to ram through a shady deal that would have seen an unknown financial advisory firm rake in an astronomical success fee for advice on raising almost $1 billion in funding. Cynthia's internal and external disclosures stopped the deal in its tracks. Judge Zondo hailed Cynthia as an example of a whistleblower who served as the final defence against corruption and state capture taking hold in state-owned entities by standing up for what was right at great personal cost. Cynthia, many congratulations. Tell us first what position you held when you blew the whistle and what that job entailed.
I was the group treasurer of South African Airways at the time I blew the whistle, and my job entailed literally managing the financial situation of SAA, the cash management, and ensuring the financial risk of the company.
In a nutshell then, tell us what you blew the whistle on.
So SAA has been in a precarious financial position for a long time, in that they were funded by the banks, but on the back of a government guarantee by National Treasury. And during the time I blew the whistle SAA was securing funds from banks. That was my job as group treasurer together with my team. We went to the banks with proposals on how to fund SAA. The time this happened, when we blew the whistle, was that board took a decision to obtain a transaction advisor via our procurement department. And this client, who was BNP Capital, won this tender at a price of 2.68 million. However, the board then made another decision to change the scope of this transaction for the small client, now unknown, to raise funds and source funds for SAA. We normally sourced funds through the banks. This client was going to do it at a cost of 256 million for work that we as the Treasury team do at the cost of our salaries.
And why? What made you decide to do it?
I've saw many things going wrong in the procurement process, so that already raised the warning bells and the red flags for me. But with this particular deal, when I actually now spoke out, was because I realized that they are choosing a client to pay 256 million that has never sourced funds before, whereas we could have paid a fraction of the cost to banks and sourced the funds directly without a middle person. I spoke to my peer level group then, and none of them wanted to stand with me. I even went back to the CFO and told her that what we're doing here is unethical and there's no way we should continue it. And I said, let's do the request for proposal again and put it out to all the clients so that there's a decent proposal that comes forward. But she ignored that and told me that I don't make the decisions around here, board does. And based on that, I went to chat to my family and I said, there's no way that I can sit back and allow this to happen. My words were, not on my watch is this going to happen.
And the testifying that you did at the Zondo Commission, what did that mean to you as a whistleblower?
I found the Zondo Commission personally to give me my voice. When I had to go for my disciplinary hearing, I could not speak there because SA was never present. The same thing happened with the Labour Court, the same thing at the CCMA. And suddenly at the Zondo Commission, I was given the platform to speak and tell what happened at SA. The DSCJ Judge Zondo asked very intricate, deep questions around my case, which I could answer. So for me, that was a platform I could speak out and provide my evidence. The net result of the Zondo Commission, I felt, was that it highlighted what had happened throughout the country with state capture. I myself was very surprised at the evidence that came out with the other divisions at SAA, like the South African Technical Division, that I had no idea that they were also involved in corruption. Our air chefs, because we were so isolated in your own division that you worked in silos and you concentrated on your job alone. So I believe the Zondo Commission added such value to our country that it brought out the whole level and depth and width of corruption, and the fact that it televised it and that one could access their website at any time and find this information is amazing, and it's something that we should not lose sight of as a country if we want to take our country forward to stop corruption.
Looking back, I wonder, would you do it again?
Definitely. I think I would definitely do it again. I think it relies solely on my conscience and everyone's conscience to do the right thing. I would do it from a principle-based and from my own personal values, which my parents had brought me up with, and which I have espoused to my family and my children. So yes, I would do it again.
Let's turn now to Bianca Goodson. She headed the management division of a South African financial advisory firm that was owned by a man called Salim Essa, a politically connected South African businessman who is now a fugitive from the law and believed to be holed up in Dubai. Goodson realised that her company was winning highly lucrative contracts from state entities at massively inflated fees for doing very little work, sometimes none at all, thanks entirely to Essa's political connections. Bianca reported her concerns to the public protector and by releasing a public statement with supporting documents before testifying in Parliament and at the Zondo Commission. Blowing the whistle, though, came at great personal cost. Bianca, many congratulations. Tell us a little more detail about the position you held when you blew the whistle, and tell us what you blew the whistle on specifically.
I was a CEO for a company called Trillion Management Consulting, and at the time I was employed to start the company. The company was intended to be a startup, so I was actually there to build it up. And particularly we had a signed contract with Eskom, so the management consulting company was intended to go into Eskom, was our national utility, and turn it around and make it comparable with the first world utility. By the time I left Trillion, they were only 3 months old, and they had amassed revenue in excess of 30 million at least. And what was so interesting about that is that they only had 2 employees. That was me and my COO. And although we're good at our work, we are not that good at our work. So the company was invoicing for work that they weren't doing. They were getting this money from our state utility. And later I found out that the money was actually going to a whole bunch of entities that had nothing to do with Trillion. So we were getting paid for nothing. The owners of the company were just getting money from our utility.
And the impulse that made you decide to do it?
I love this country. And what these people were doing was bad for the country. And I want my daughter to live in South Africa where there isn't load shedding, where she can actually consider working in public service and know that it doesn't involve kickbacks. So I'm very passionate about where I live and the promise that this country has. And what these guys were doing was wrong. I just firmly believe that.
In common with so many who blow the whistle, this has taken a severe toll on your personal life. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I've been diagnosed with PTSD, so I suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. My husband at the time didn't agree with me blowing the whistle. It created so much conflict that we got divorced. Subsequently become unemployable because I'm seen as somebody who speaks out too much. So it's had devastating consequences. But now that you can see the wheels of justice are turning, although the consequences are still devastating on a personal basis, it's starting to look as though maybe the sacrifice was worth it. I'm not sure. I'm not sure yet.
And these disclosures led to criminal prosecutions. Tell us what that's meant to you.
I'm glad that there is a sense of justice that we do see moving quite slowly. I'm glad that there is a message being sent out there that people who do things like this, our legal system will find them and they will have to be held accountable for their actions. And I'm glad that we are sending a message that we don't tolerate this, that this is not the kind of new way of working, you know. So I'm happy about that. It'll be nice to see more convictions. It'll be nice to see more people being held responsible, because I don't think we've completely ventilated that. But we'll see. I think it may still be early days.
Given everything that you've said, would you do it again? Were there any positive outcomes for you?
My disclosure resulted in Eskom getting 1.6 billion rand back, so that was good. And getting that acknowledgement from Eskom CEO Andre de Ruyter was great. I'm glad that I can be an example for my daughter and not just tell her that she has integrity, but she can see through my life how to demonstrate it. It's unfortunate, though, that she also witnesses the consequences that it comes with. I would like it to be easier for people to be honest and transparent. But I think overall it's been good. I've been forced into a midlife crisis. I need to redefine, and that's okay. That's okay.
Now, our third South African whistleblower is Athol Williams. He's had a very different experience. He was a business ethics lecturer in Cape Town when the American consulting firm Bain & Co. hired him after the company was implicated in corruption in South Africa. He resigned from Bain after accusing the company of a cover-up. At the Zondo Commission, Athol testified how Bain had forged a secretive personal relationship with President Jacob Zuma and entered dubious contractual relationships with individuals close to him. He also provided evidence of how Bain had masterminded a highly destructive restructuring plan for the South African Revenue Service, SARS for short, that led to an exodus of skilled officials and weakened its ability to fight tax corruption. The Zondo Commission singled out Athol Williams in its appreciation for the evidence he presented on the capture of the Revenue Service and for rejecting numerous attempts by Bain to buy his silence. Athol, too, has suffered enormously for the decisions that he made. It was a real privilege that Athol was able to join us in person in the studio earlier. Congratulations, Athol, for winning this award. I think it would be helpful for you to describe first for us what state capture is.
Razia, I place state capture somewhere between corruption and a coup. Corruption is largely when there's transactions between two parties that's going to take public funds into private pockets, right? And that's how we understand corruption very broadly. State capture is not as simple as that. It's often a web. There's a web that gets created across society and through society, government, business, etc., to facilitate this corruption of moving of public funds into private hands. But in order to make this happen, to have this web work and sustain the web, you often have to weaken state institutions. And what happens is these institutions become repurposed.
Just remind us briefly on how Bain and Company helped President Jacob Zuma capture SARS and then tried to pretend that it didn't happen or to try to cover it up.
So my understanding of what happened is based on the evidence that I got access to while I was at Bain. So I was not at Bain during this period when Bain was meeting with President Jacob Zuma. And from my count, there were up to 18 meetings behind closed doors after hours. There were clandestine meetings, if ever there were clandestine meetings. And the nature of these discussions is quite alarming based on the materials I got access to and that I shared with the Zondo Commission. There was talk about restructuring how cabinet ministers would operate. There was talk about restructuring whole sectors of our society in such a way that we brought all the decision-making under one person and one structure, as opposed to now where it's distributed. There were plans designed to centralize all of government procurement, for example. So imagine if you're trying to loot a state, right now you've got to loot multiple different organizations. If you brought it all together, how much easier that would be. There were detailed plans about replacing board members, replacing CEOs in some of the state-owned enterprises so that, again, they could be aligned to what the overall state capture plan was. Now what Bain would say is that they went in and did normal restructuring of an organization they would ordinarily do in any organization. And this is where my knowledge of management consulting and my knowledge of Bain's operations was useful to the Zondo Commission, because it's a very simple idea that says restructuring an organization is such an intrusive exercise, because you basically break how things work. There are relationships between people, there are systems in place, there are processes in place. You break all of that and you reassemble it in this new structure. You only do that as a last resort. And so if, as Bain claims, SARS was this fantastic institution that had some opportunities for improvement, the first thing you do is you tweak the systems. You might replace some people. You don't go and wholesale restructure the organization, which is what happened. And the only way to...
Which you're suggesting was a cover for what they were trying to
Absolutely, absolutely. And we see that, Razia, in terms of which parts of the organization suddenly disappeared. So the enforcement capability, for example, right? There was a whole dedicated enforcement capability within SARS, which was world-class, about going after tax evaders. That whole function got disbanded. And the people, to the extent they were still around, were dispersed across the organization. And so this was a clear act of trying to disable what SARS could do. But it was couched in these terms around restructuring the organization for improvement. It was also couched in terms of CEO coaching. So Bain has this practice, which I was part of when I was a partner at Bain, of helping a new executive, a new CEO, into their new role. But this was not CEO coaching. These were dedicated, deliberate plans for the new person, Tom Moyane, to go into SARS, and it was basically his playbook for how he was going to bring about this repurposing of SARS.
So let's just focus on you and your role. Yeah. What made you blow the whistle? What was the impulse for you?
I think we have to decide what kind of society we want to live in, how we get there, and what our role has to be in that. And at best, reflective people would do that and have answers to those questions. I think most of us, sadly, aren't that reflective, and so don't do this consciously. But I certainly made a conscious decision, and I've been working on this for a number of years, of saying, yes, I want to live in a prosperous South Africa. I want to live in a free, democratic South Africa. But for me, where we'd gone wrong was our moral poverty that in many ways, for me, surpasses the economic poverty we have. There was a moral poverty. And so the society I want to live in and what I began to work towards was an ethical society, because I believe an ethical society becomes a prosperous society. So that's my society I want to live in. Then I'd say, what role do I play in it? And we live in a world where self-interest seems to be paramount. We literally live in a world where we consciously train people at business schools, we train people at universities, that if you only focus on yourself, if you maximize profit and personal wealth, you're doing good in society. And I disagree with that. And I think that's what made me many enemies, because I fundamentally disagree with that. And so I believe we must pursue economic growth and prosperity, but never at the expense of human rights or the environment or animal abuse, etc. So, sorry, that was a roundabout way of answering your question. But why did I do it? Was because I saw what Bain had been involved in its potential involvement in state capture, and the cover-up, as going against everything I believe was good for South Africa. Because what South Africa needed was strong democratic institutions. If Bain had been part of disabling those institutions, then in my mind they've committed just an absolute heinous crime that I would not want to be part of.
But to huge cost. I mean, at huge cost to you and potentially life-threatening. So tell us a little bit about what the impact of that decision, that second decision, was for you.
I understood that what I was doing by revealing what Bain had done and was covering up, I understood that I would experience retaliation from Bain. I understood that. What I didn't expect was that I would experience retaliation from the broader South African society, from the basically entire South African business community, from our own government. That
How
I didn't
did it
expect.
manifest itself?
So it manifests itself in the sense that I was offered absolutely no protection from any state institution. So I'd gone public on the day of my testimony, and I testified for 2 days at the Zondo Commission in public. So there was no hiding. It was very clear what I was saying and what my testimony was.
Everybody knew your name. They knew what you looked like.
Yeah, absolutely. The evening of my testimony, I got a call from a director of PLAF, the International Whistleblower Organization, who was also involved with Edward Snowden, and they work in protecting whistleblowers, particularly in Africa. A director called me and said, "Athol, you need to get out of the country." And I was at home with my family celebrating because I'd finally finished this testimony, which had been a big part of my life. And she said, what you have done is you've connected the dots and you've named people, you've provided hard evidence, and so you are in danger. When we see people do this, typically they are in danger. And she went through great detail of how they would help me get out of the country for my safety. And I mean, that certainly spoiled the party for me, but it highlighted this idea that, oh my God, I could actually be in real physical danger here. I never believed that Bain would want to physically harm me, but they certainly wanted to silence me. And so I had no idea how far they'd go. But it wasn't only Bain, it was all the others that I'd implicated. And I began to And so that alerted me to the danger. And then I started getting warnings from people. I got warnings from people in government saying, your name is being mentioned in places we wouldn't want your name mentioned. A former senior government ANC official wrote to me saying, you're in the crosshairs. You need to get out of the country. And then what sparked it for me was when a fellow whistleblower got assassinated in August of 2021. And it made it just real that this was not a game. This was not just standing up and getting support and I'd be able to handle this. She was assassinated, and when I then spoke to NGOs, when I spoke to businesses, when I spoke to people in the government I know, basically they all said there's nothing we can do and so I had to leave. And so in November of last year, I made that traumatic decision to leave my home with just the bags I had, leave my family behind, because my life was in danger.
When you say state capture is still present and alive in South Africa today, you are a child of apartheid. You know, in your mid-20s, apartheid came to an end. And I wonder how you reflect on the society that South Africa is post-1994.
I'm disappointed, and often I'm sad by what has become of our country, because I think we held such promise in terms of where we wanted the country to go and where it could go. I understand practically that we were in a big hole, right? Apartheid hollowed out our society, so we were in a big hole, and so it wasn't going to be smooth sailing. But I think what we've done by having corrupt political leadership is we've dug ourselves deeper into that hole as opposed to getting ourselves out of the hole. And so I think that's the part that saddens me, that disappoints me, because South Africa was not just a model for our own country and the continent, but to the world in terms of the possibility that we hold. It was a miracle that we could go from hundreds of years of colonialism and apartheid and do this in a way that seemed to show the possibility for human reconciliation and for human harmony. And I think we're letting the world down by the way we're going about it. And of course, we're letting many millions of South Africans down by the way we are departing and I think diverting from the promise of what South Africa holds.
Athol Williams, South Africa is lucky to have you. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Absolute pleasure.
Thank you. Now, it's not unusual that when whistleblowers have evidence of corruption, they're often told to approach the police. But what if the perpetrators are police officials themselves? That is the conundrum Patricia Mashale has faced. Patricia was employed as a senior administrative clerk in the firearms division of the South African Police Department. When she blew the whistle on police officials illegally selling firearms to criminal syndicates and compiled a dossier detailing evidence of alleged corruption and abuse of power, she and her family were subjected to a terrifying campaign of retaliation. She now lives in hiding in different locations and fears for her life. A police threat assessment was confirmed her life was at risk, but she has vowed she will never be silenced. Patricia, many congratulations on this Special Recognition Award. The first thing that you blew the whistle on involved issues surrounding firearms in the division where you worked. Give us some more detail about that.
In 2018, I came across some suspicious activities on the system, whereby firearms that were meant for destruction was removed by police officials from the provincial storage facility and sold back into the black market. I informed my commander about it, and he asked me to go deeper into the system so that we can see how these firearms are being removed and how these firearms are being sold. And I came across like a syndicate of police officers, dealers, individuals who are working hand in hand in removing these firearms from the storage facilities. I called the National Commissioner and I informed him about it. He referred me to the former head of the Hawks, the PCI, and said I must go and report it to him. So I went to Major General Mootley and I reported it to him. So Major General Mootley established a task team to investigate. That was in around April 2020, just before the lockdown.
And what actions did the police officials you exposed take against you?
One of the senior generals that I also reported, that I also implicated now, went to the domestic family court and obtained a protection order against me in order to stop me to speak out about him being implicated in this corruption. And then he also opened criminal charges of harassment against me. And then on 14 October 2021, my phone was also now seized, my personal phone, on instruction of the same general who alleged that I sent some defamatory WhatsApps about him. So the phone was seized based on that information. They opened cases of harassment against me, and I was actually arrested. And the charges in these harassment cases is spreading false allegations against the subs management. There's definitely a pattern. It's definitely a pattern because all happened since I blew the whistle on them.
I'm sure this is quite difficult, but what about those direct threats to your own safety?
The first direct threat that I encountered is in February of this year. That is when one of my former colleagues informed me that he got information from a senior official at the Grootvlei Correctional Services. One of the generals came to him and asked him that he's going to get me arrested, and then that official must ensure that I get absorbed in the correctional services without being registered on the system, and anything would have happened to me at that time. And that correctional official was very concerned. That's why he gave the information to that person to say, "Our life is in danger, please advise her to go in hiding." That's when I went immediately in hiding. 2 days after I went in hiding, this general indeed went to the police station to open a case against me, forced the detective to effect arrest on me. The detective actually called me on that day to say, "The general is here, he wants you to be arrested." And I tell the general he must wait because I'm in hiding. I got information that he was going to open a case against me, and that he already make arrangements for me to be sent to a correctional facility where I will not be registered and where I was going to be killed.
And I understand that there were also threats against your family too.
I don't see my children regularly, and that was one of the days that I met with them. And then after that, it was late. He took me to my hideout, and we were followed by this black Ford Ranger. It was a high-speed chase out. It was. Imagine a Ford Ranger with an Opel. My son-in-law, I don't know what I would have done because I panicked. I knew what was going to happen. They were going to shoot us. My son-in-law kept calm, and he just evaded them. He just evaded them narrowly. If we didn't drove to the Athol township, and you could see those people that don't really know Bloemfontein. Because when we arrived in the Athol township, you could see we lost them there. And if it was not for that, I would not have been there. Yeah. And then I received information later about the whistleblower from, I think it is a Home Affairs, who was also assassinated in front of his house, and the same Ford Ranger was seen as the people who assassinated him. The black Ford Ranger without the number plates. In June of this year, officers of crime intelligence approached my brother to source information from him. Actually, let me be frank. The person who approached my brother was the commander of Warrant Officer Masdorp to source information about my whereabouts after Warrant Officer Masdorp refused to give information of my whereabouts. Then shortly after that, while he was on his way from work to home, a white bakkie approached him and they shoot at him. If he didn't run into the yard of the house where he was passing, he would have been dead.
How have all of these experiences, Patricia, and living in hiding too, affected you personally?
Before I went into hiding, I was admitted in the hospital for stress. I lost my medical aid. I couldn't continue with my medication. My son was already booked for operation on his finger in March. We had to cancel all that. Being in hiding, I'm alone. Remember, I told you that I was on stress medication. I don't have that medication anymore. I'm alone. My little boy is 11 years old. He cannot be with me. He had to go through this year to school. We had to change him from schools. We had to bring him from Tromsø to Bloemfontein. There was already a huge adjustment for him. Me not being there to help him to adjust in the new school. Me not being there to help him with the homework. Me not being there with his meetings, with his achievements, with whatever. My children just had to live with the fact that their mother is not even dead. I'm still there, but I cannot be with them. It's painful. It's very painful. And my family they destroyed my family. They destroyed my family because we can't have a normal life like their families. They have normal life with their children. They have normal lives with the family. We are now in the season, family season, festive season, where I cannot be with my children. I cannot be with my family. I cannot do the normal things like going on holidays, like we did every year. Every day in December, we booked the holidays and we went on holidays with my family. We cannot do that anymore. I don't know when my life going to be normal again. I don't know if my life is going to be normal ever again. When we talk in terms of GBV, I feel that, yes, I feel that my government is subjecting me to gender-based violence because I'm a woman. I'm being abused by my government. I don't get any support from my government. I'm talking about the Children's Act. My child, the basic rights have been taken away from him, of not getting the care and the love of his mother.
What was it that made you decide in the end to blow the whistle?
For me, it's something's either wrong or right. Everything that I saw in the South African Police Service was wrong. Everything they did in the South African Police Service was and is still wrong. And I told myself I will not keep quiet about this. First and foremost, I took an oath of office to say that I will speak out about the wrongdoing in my workplace. And I don't even do it in my workplace only. I do it everywhere I go. I talk out about the wrongdoing. I taught my children that if something is wrong, you must speak out about it. And that's what motivates me. And the other thing is, the South African Police Service is there to protect and serve. And if the crime are being committed by police officers, how are we going now to go out and say we are going to handle criminals when the criminals themselves are inside of the South African Police Service? That's not doable.
You've clearly made enormous sacrifices. Has blowing the whistle led to positive changes that you can talk about?
Definitely. It definitely led to positive change. A lot of police officers, not only police officers, even civilians, came forward and they started to blow the whistle. They started to talk out about the wrongdoing in the workplace. And even those who were complicit to whistleblowing came to me and said, you know what, I once did this, but because of what you are doing, I want to rectify it. I want to do it the way you are doing it. So yes, there's a lot of positive that came out of my whistleblowing.
Given everything that's happened, when you look back, would you do it again?
Definitely. I will definitely do it again. I just didn't bargain on everything that was going to happen to me. But if someone tells me that this is going to happen when you do this, I will do it again.
From South Africa, we're going to turn our attention to Australia and the winner of the Blueprint International Whistleblowing Prize for 2022, David McBride. David has an extraordinary story of truth-telling about alleged war crimes. The impact of his disclosures has reverberated internationally. A lawyer serving Australian Special Forces as a major in Afghanistan, as well as a former captain in the British Army, David McBride is being honoured for his steadfast integrity. David McBride's first conflict with his military command came when he refused to prosecute Australian soldiers for an array of offences that he regarded as utterly baseless. He said he was confused about why he was being pressured to lay unjustified charges. Ultimately, he formed the view that he was being used to create a busy smokescreen around a series of what he viewed as far more sinister activities. Mr. McBride compiled a series of reports around the deaths of civilians and prisoners at the hands of Australian forces that he believed had not been properly investigated. He supplied his report internally, and that was ignored. Growing increasingly alarmed at the lack of response, David McBride passed parts of his report to journalists at the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. In 2019, the ABC published The Afghan Files, a 7-part series of reports which provided the Australian public with their first insight into a shocking array of alleged war crimes committed in Afghanistan. The ABC report led to an unprecedented attack from the Australian federal government on the national broadcaster. In June 2019, the Australian Federal Police stormed the ABC's Sydney headquarters and seized confidential materials relating to the Afghan files. This wasn't the only outcome, however. A year later, in 2020, an official investigation by the Inspector General of the Australian Defence Force published its findings. The Brereton report effectively vindicated David McBride's decision to come forward. This report into Australia's longest war found credible information that members of the Australian Special Forces had committed war crimes during their operations in Afghanistan between 2005 and 2016. The report found that Australian soldiers were implicated in the murder of 39 Afghans in 23 separate incidents and recommended that 36 cases should be subject to criminal investigation. To date, not a single one of the alleged perpetrators has been charged. The only person facing jail is David McBride, the man who first alerted his command to these alleged war crimes. There's been growing community opposition to the prosecution of David McBride, but regardless of that, Australia's Labor government is continuing to pursue the criminal charges initiated under the previous government. David McBride's trial is likely to happen next year, and if he's found guilty, he faces up to 50 years in prison. Earlier I spoke to David, the winner of Blueprint's International Whistleblowing Prize. David, many congratulations on this award.
Thank you so much.
I mean, your background is both in the army and in the legal profession. How shocked were you, personally, given that context, that you discovered the way in which some soldiers inside the Australian Army had behaved?
I was pretty shocked, but not just with the soldiers. I think I was more shocked with the generals. In any organisation, a fish rots from the head down, as they say, and I believed that while it might not have been so shocking, the bad behaviour and the lies started at the top. They may not have been quite so obvious as shooting people in the head and saying that they were Taliban, but lying about the aims of the war, the conduct of the war, the progress of the war, filtered down to the soldiers. I went to Sandhurst, and I really believed back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, that the officers and the way I was taught in the British Army was very much about doing the right thing at all times. I think something has changed. I was quite shocked that that attitude was considered quite out of date. It really shook me a great deal. In fact, it probably gave me a certain amount of post-traumatic stress disorder to see that people at higher ranks and even people in the special forces were saying one thing, talking about doing the right thing, talking about honour, talking about truth, but knowingly doing something quite different. That did quite shock me.
That's quite something that you feel that resulted in personal trauma for you. Can you talk a little more about how that manifested itself? Because the psychological impact of being regarded as somebody who is traitorous, if you like, to the Australian state, and yet what you were doing was something that you thought was morally the right thing to do. That must have been quite a shock to your own psyche.
Yeah, it's a big shock. And if I hadn't had such a good background from my father and probably from Oxford University and Sandhurst, I don't know if I would have survived. I grew up believing in Western democracy, believing in parliamentary democracy, believing that wherever the forces of NATO or Britain or America or Australia went, good would follow. And I saw the clash of politics and truth in Afghanistan and realised that if we weren't already the bad guys, we weren't far off from being the bad guys.
Let's go back a little bit, because you were acting as a lawyer for the Australian Army and looking into people who were defending military personnel who were thought to have engaged in some wrongdoing, but you were critical of that process. Just talk us through what it was that you felt was wrong with that process, which led you to really question a lot more after that.
Yes, it is an interesting journey that I had, and I like to emphasise it because I grew up in the Sandhurst tradition, and it was the one thing an officer has to do, and that is to stand up and support his troops when things go wrong. And I could see that we were trying to make scapegoats of people who hadn't actually done anything wrong. And I found this very strange. While there was lots of rumours about murders and slaughtering of people, basically, the three cases that I dealt with in 2013 were not such, and they were looking like we just wanted to round up the usual suspects and put them in jail. And it just made me wonder why. Why are we not investigating some very, very suspicious things from 2012, and why are we investigating or trying to put people in jail who've clearly just done their job? And it was actually that started me on the trail. And the more I looked into it, I came to the conclusion that we had become so cynical and we had made the mistake of lionising certain individuals who turned out to actually be bad, and they turned out to actually be likely to have been the killers. But because everything was based around PR, we couldn't have our star players put on trial, because that would damage our PR efforts. So in a very cynical move, we looked for some non-entities to put in jail as if that would be just as good. And as an old school officer, that just made my blood boil. The idea that you would let some guilty people go free because they were famous and put innocent people in jail because they were non-entities. That, when I heard that, and when that became clear to me, even though I knew I was taking on a David and Goliath task, I knew I would not rest until either I was dead or I'd achieved my aim to expose that, because that was an absolute betrayal of everything we are meant to stand for.
So in the wake of the disclosures and the reporting by media organisations, Australia did launch an independent inquiry, the Brereton Report, which vindicated you and also recommended prosecutions. It is curious, though, David, that it seems now that you are the only person who is being prosecuted. And I wonder what you have to say about that. Why do you think that is?
It's very curious, isn't it? And I guess it's because the problem is much bigger than just a few corporals shooting people. As I've said, that bad as that is, we have a problem with truth in the Australian military, I think probably in Britain and America as well, where the truth no longer matters. War is about PR, and they are more angry with me because I am more dangerous to the state than a corporal is who shoots a soldier, or shoots a civilian. They do not want it really getting out that it wasn't really just war crimes, but it was the fact that we falsified the war aims, we falsified the war's progress, we falsified who our allies were, and that they think is dangerous, and they certainly don't want other people coming after me.
It's extraordinary to hear you speak about this in the way that you do, with really quite striking calmness, I would say. I wonder, though, if I can get you to reflect on the relationship between the people of Australia and the idea of democracy, because even states that say that national security is a defence in all kinds of contexts, in the end, it is about a free country, isn't it? I mean, it is about those principles that you grew up being committed to, that feel as though they could be in peril.
I totally agree. Australia and even the UK, I obviously have a great love for it. Because parliamentary democracy was born there. They are ideals. They're not just land masses. And if Australia doesn't stand for something, we are nothing. If we become just a nation of real estate agents, which we are fast becoming, what's the point of Australia if law no longer applies, if we no longer give people a fair go, if we're no longer the land where we gave women the vote early, and we did so many things we can be proud of. If we become this sort of police state with a sunny climate, I don't think there's any point in it being Australia. The values are what matters, not the landmass.
It's so heartening to hear you speak in this way, and also I wonder if I can ask you to reflect a little on the UK, which with a country that you are connected to really quite profoundly too. You gave an interview to the BBC's Panorama programme in the context of their own investigation into special forces in Afghanistan. I mean, do you see similarities between what you uncovered in the Australian forces in Afghanistan and the British forces there?
Yes, Absolutely. In fact, if anything, the breaches were more blatant with the British forces than they were in the Australian forces. In fact, there is some evidence to suggest the really bad lessons the Australian Special Forces learnt, they learnt from the Brits, and they learnt, unfortunately, from the Americans. Things like just shoot whoever you want, and then get a weapon out of your bag, put it on the dead body, take a photo, and there you go, Taliban. There should be investigations, there should be trials. The Panorama people showed me evidence that good cases were prepared against the British Special Forces by military police, and the military police were outraged that the cases were dropped. Now, some cases will always be dropped, no problem with that, but the fact that not a single case went ahead after many being prepared can only mean political interference. It's not a grey area. It was clearly the politicians who decided it was a bad look to put soldiers on trial, and they knocked them all on the head. I think the same thing is probably happening in Australia. We made a big fuss about the Brereton inquiry. There hasn't been, I think the Special Investigations Unit are only just beginning. No one will be charged for many years. Now that is suspicious. It looks like we are deliberately going slow. And again, just like the war, just like the things I pointed out, it's because we care more about opinion polls than doing the right thing.
There is a major war in Europe at the moment, and I wonder what implications there are in terms of the war crimes that we know that have already taken place inside Ukraine. If governments, in the way in which you're talking about, Western democracies are behaving and have behaved in the theatre of war, what kind of implications do you think that might have for the prosecution of war crimes in Ukraine after that war is over? Indeed, evidence is being gathered as we speak.
It'll have huge implications. And this was one of the problems I always had speaking to journalists from the beginning, to say these sounds like airy-fairy concepts, but they're anything but. It's never been about Afghanistan. It's about the next war. It's about Ukraine. And if we think that the PR message is more important than the truth, and we will do anything to rubbish our enemies and talk up our allies because that fits the greater geopolitical story, we will exaggerate Russian war crimes, and we will whitewash and cover up any Ukrainian war crimes. Now, that may seem clever for some sort of short-term goal, but I can assure people that it's not clever, because, as I said, if we lie about murders in our own ranks and we lie about what went on in our enemies' ranks, we are no longer the good guys of the world. We are increasingly becoming the bad guys, and in which case we don't have a leg to stand on.
David McBride, everything you're saying suggests that you would blow the whistle again.
I'd have no doubt. It's the best thing I've ever done in my life. I'm so proud of it, and my children are proud of it. And as I said, I'm 58 now. If I spend the rest of my life, if I die in prison, I won't have had a bad life. I've got two wonderful children. I've had a fantastic time in the UK Army, which was beyond my expectations. Been to Oxford University. I can't complain. I've had a pretty good life, and I do have to give something back. If this is how I have to do it, it's a great cause to be involved in. It's something much bigger than myself, and plenty of people in the last 500 years have sacrificed more than me. So I'm glad to step in behind them.
You're an extraordinary inspiration. David McBride, congratulations once again. Thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thanks, Razia. Thank you.
Now, we've just been hearing about the challenges Australia and its allies face in prosecuting war crimes. One country for which the investigation of war crimes is currently a particularly urgent priority is, of course, Ukraine. Joining me now is Dr. Gaiane Nuridzhanian, who is an associate professor at the National University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy in Ukraine and a postdoctoral research fellow at UiT Arctic University of Norway. And she joins us from Norway. A very warm welcome to you. Let's start by getting you to describe for us what the current situation is when it comes to the investigations of war crimes and the prosecutions that are taking place in Ukraine, if indeed any are, because the names of places where we've seen just terrible horror that has taken place are becoming familiar to us. Kherson, Bakhmut, Bucha, Irpin, all of these places are places where we know terrible things have happened. But what is happening in terms of the prosecution of war crimes?
Indeed, there are investigations taking place at the domestic level in Ukraine. And just recently, the head of the War Crimes Department of the Prosecutor General Office of Ukraine said that they had registered 48,000 war crimes, meaning that cases that could be war crimes. But actually, the number of the cases in which there has been some progress is much lower, of course. We've seen already some convictions by the tribunal, by courts in Ukraine. So we have about a dozen Russian soldiers convicted. We have more cases pending before the court. So the cases in which the investigations have already been completed and they've been sent to the court. And I think there are around 60 cases. There are around 200 cases in which the prosecutors have identified the suspect, have collected enough evidence to kind of notify the suspect about the case and to proceed to further stages of investigations. So there is definitely some progress taking place at the domestic level when we are talking about this kind of quantitative indicators.
And evidence presumably is being collected all the time on the ground.
Yeah, that's the case. And I think that's one of the unique features of this situation and investigating war crimes in Ukraine, because it's taking place as the war is ongoing.
You mentioned that it is unique that Ukraine is the war in Ukraine is actually allowing people to gather evidence while the war is being conducted, which makes it very different to other theatres of war. Do you think that that will create a precedent in terms of how war crimes are prosecuted generally from now on? I mean, is this a kind of different watershed moment?
I think it very much depends on factual circumstances. Ukraine faces an invasion from another state, and that's one of the reasons why Ukraine is open to international presence in Ukraine, to fostering the cooperation with International Criminal Court. If we are faced with a conflict where there is fighting between governmental forces and non-governmental forces inside one state, it may be much more difficult to have access to this situation, exactly because government may not be willing to grant such access to international actors. But if we are facing a similar situation in Ukraine, as we see in Ukraine, this might create a precedent. And I think another reason is that Ukrainian society is adapting to life in conditions of war, and that kind of reverberates into different spheres of life. So it's people who are adapting, but it's also state institutions, it's courts, it's the parliament. Everyone tries to kind of continue working in these war conditions, and that's why it's possible to carry on work in Ukraine.
Dr. Gaiane Nuridzhanian, thank you very much indeed for speaking with us. Thanks for joining us from Norway.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Our very warm congratulations to David McBride and to Bianca Goodson, Cynthia Stimpel, Athol Williams and Patricia Mashale, the winners of this year's Blueprint Whistleblowing Prizes. We can, of course, only hope to scratch the surface of these stories in a programme like this. If you'd like to know more, you can find more detail on the Blueprint for Free Speech website. Now, whistleblowers like the ones that we have heard from this evening, unbelievably inspirational people, have put a lot on the line in order to bring critical information to the public, information that can be of national or international importance. But whistleblowers exist in all walks of life, in workplaces and public services, in schools and hospitals, in financial institutions and the police. Voicing your support for better legal protections at every level, speaking up to support whistleblowers speaking out, makes a real difference. Protections are increasing, but slowly, and that can only happen with strong public support. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We'll be back next year, honouring the whistleblowers behind the key stories of 2023. Who knows what the next year will bring? Good night.